Okay. This one's a little weirder because most of the stuff that's shitty about the Spartan Empire has been made cool somehow by pop culture. But 3 shitty things about Spartans! First of all, most of the stories you hear about the Spartans are about the free citizens class. And this may lead you to believe that most people in Spartan society were in fact free citizens. But the Helots were a slave class made up mostly of indigenous peoples and people from conquered nations. And while Spartans enjoyed a reputation of being the bravest people on Earth, they lived in constant fear of a slave uprising due to them outnumbering the Spartans 7-1. For all the toxic frat boys that love this culture, it's funny to think that they actually liked little boys. Look, I'm not gonna get too far into it because I feel it's pretty well documented in Greek culture. The Spartans justified this behavior as an older class of warrior passing virtue down to the younger class of warrior. In fact, many people take this scene in the movie as a metaphor for that practice. Women were baby-making machines. While it is true that women were afforded more liberties in the Spartan culture, things like education and sport, it was only because they thought it made stronger boys, nothing else. Let's do it. 3 shitty things about the Spartans, part 2! If you're pro-life, you're gonna hate the Spartans. Every boy born to a free citizen had to face the Council of Inspectors. This council would look for any defect within the newborn. And just so you know, excessive crying was considered a defect. If a defect was found, the baby was left on the hillside to the elements for 3 days. If it survived the elements without, freezing to death or being eaten by wolves, it could reintegrate into society as a slave. Did you know the Spartans had their own Gestapo? If you watched my last video about the Helots, you remember that the Spartans lived in constant fear of a slave revolt. The secret police would scour the countryside for uppity Helots, do terrible things as a coming-of-age ritual. They were imperialist, authoritarian douchebags, which is kind of weird considering how much they vilified this guy in the movie. Sparta very much wanted to spread its utopian views to neighboring states. After conquering a state, Sparta would install a pro-Spartan oligarchy. Known as the 30 Tyrants, they would immediately begin erasing a country's history, democracy, and taking away civil rights. The samurai is often romanticized a lot in Western culture. So here are 3 shady things about the samurai. The first thing people think of when it comes to the samurai is their Bushido or honor code. But that code was reserved for people of their feudal class or higher, not for peasants. Kurisuke Gomen afforded the samurai the ability to kill whoever they want as long as he felt insulted. The wives of samurais were basically slaves. Okusan were expected to stay home, meek and silent, and tend to their husband's every need. They often had to pay their husband just to marry them, and they were expected to be on call 24/7 for sex, even though their husband had a shit ton of mistresses. Alright, bit of a trigger warning for this one because it gets kinda weird. Wakashudo translates to the way of the adolescent boy. Basically, a samurai can take on a child apprentice and basically legally. The act was said to increase the bond between the two as the boy became into a man and left his master for women. But nowadays, we know what the fuck it was about. Anyways, let me know if you want me to ruin Last Samurai for you. Oh look, another person espousing the virtues of the samurai. You know what that means. It's time for 3 shady things about the samurai, part 2! First off, the Ronin weren't all that great. If you watched my video on The Last Samurai, you learned that during the Boshin War, the samurai were stripped of their titles. After that, a lot of samurais just went to careers in the military. Some decided to be farm workers, but many others were like, nah, I'm still gonna samurai. And while pop culture is filled with virtuous acts of the wayward samurai, many more Ronin turned to crime. Lots of crime. All the crime! Hey, did you know the samurai tested their blades on humans? You know Tamashigiri, right? It's that thing Doug does on Forged in Fire. They did that on humans. Now granted, it was mostly done on cadavers, but a lot was practiced on prisoners. And many samurai would practice it on drunks and vagrants in the night, and because of the laws, they can get away with it. Did you know that the fall of the samurai led directly into the Yakuza, the biggest, most profitable mob operation ever? You see, the criminal Ronin went into 2 major businesses. The first was tekia, the sale of illicit or stolen goods. Second was bakudo, or gambling. These led to the power structures of the Yakuza. Yes! And I'm glad you asked, because just doing samurais kind of made me feel like I was shitting on somebody else's culture. So hopefully this evens the scales a bit. Here are 3 shitty things about knights. First off, knights were lazy as fuck. If there wasn't a war, they only had to work for the king for like a month out of the year. And most of the time it was just escorting royalty from like place to place. That's far from the steadfast commitment and work ethic we see in films. And even if there was a war, knights never really had to worry about being killed. Knights were the only ones on the battlefield that got to ride horses. This gave them a huge advantage. Even if they were dehorsed, they were captured, not killed, because they were considered valuable assets to the king and could be ransomed back for a hefty amount. Captured knights weren't jailed or tortured in the same way a peasant was. They were fed fantastically and even given wine to accommodate their stay. Finally, chivalry has always been dead. Much like the Bushido Code, chivalry was pretty much reserved for people of your same class and higher. Peasants can basically get bent. Don't even get me started on the way they pursued women. Hey, want me to ruin handkerchief as a means for flirting? Alright. 3 shady things about knights, part 2. First off, knights, they were just terrible to their serfs. They would stand by bridges and crossroads and purposely harass men's wives to get them to fight for their honor. Then they'd just kill them. And they would harass women, often tearing off portions of their clothing. And since clothing wasn't mass-made in the way it is today, they would have to go back to their abuser to pick up that article of clothing. It became so common that women often carried loose articles of clothing just to throw it down to get rid of them. Things they didn't care about, so they didn't have to go back. Like handkerchiefs. In a weird turn of events, this custom became a form of flirting. Most knights weren't actually that great at fighting. After their apprenticeship in knighthood, their training was pretty much left to themselves. And outside of the knight's tournament, there wasn't really much to practice for. And most didn't. They depended on their horses and their armor to win in battle, not their skill. Even still, most knights weren't effective in battle. Because there was no standardized group training system established by the king, most knights had no cohesion when they got together on the battlefield. Because of this, they were often easily foiled by the Swiss.